3D. What does this mean? Well, we're not going to be modeling monsters and creating amazing worlds. Um, that's not what After Effects is really for. And so I can't really say that it is 3D, um, but it kind of is. Most people call it 2.5D. um, you'll see that we'll be able to move layers through space and orient them in space in a three-dimensional fashion. However, the layers still are paper thin. You can't, um, well, maybe you can because you're lucky enough to have the Creative Cloud. They've just totally revamped everything with the Creative Cloud and After Effects, and they've included Cinema 4D primitives and tools in After Effects, which is really cool. Um, like I've said before, we don't have the Creative Cloud yet because we're in negotiations with Adobe, trying to figure out how we're going to make that work here on campus. So I'm still using, I think this is Creative Suite 5.5 on my Mac Pro in my office. I have Creative Suite 6, so I have so many different versions of After Effects. I think I still have like a version 4 hanging around because sometimes you need older versions to work with older projects or whatever. How did I get off on that tangent? I tend to do that. Now let's open up your 3D Basics After Effects project, and what you're going to find is I've again created some comps, and we're going to play around with these compositions just to kind of get a little dose of what this 3D staging means and how to get a grasp on it at a very basic level, and we'll get more detailed later. So in comp number 1, 3D intro, I have 3 layers set up here, 1, 2, and 3. And it's just a solid layer. It's 100 pixels wide by 100 pixels tall, and they each have a number on them. And these are nested comps. If you'll notice in the timeline, they're a composition, and that's what lies inside the planes folder here is 1, 2, and 3, because I had to make them a flattened version of a solid and a number so that we didn't have too many things to choreograph here. Makes it a little bit easier. So if we look at the layer number 1, and let's twist open the transform attributes. We have the attributes that we've been used to here, but they're the ones that are spatial are limited to an X and a Y value. You also want to make sure that you have toggled switches, not modes. You want the row of boxes next to each layer, not the pull-down menus for track mats or modes. So here, the boxes are split into columns of different information, and for the most part, we've only talked about motion blur so far. And we're not going to talk about all of them, but we'll get through 2 more new buttons for you in this group of videos here. So if you notice, the columns are all topped with an icon here along this row, and the rightmost column is the 3D switch. So I'm going to enable 3D for layer number 1. Or it's not layer number 1, it's the number 1. I should have thought about that, shouldn't I? I should have just ordered them so that they were 1, 2, and 3. Was here, number 1 is layer number 3. Blah! I'm confusing myself. So alright, I just turned on the cube, enabling 3D. And you're going to see right offhand a couple of things change. In the attributes, any of the spatial values have now grown to have 3 values, x, y, and a z. So position has x, y, and z. Scale has x, y, and z for scale. Then we have a new one called orientation. It starts to get a little confusing. I skip it for now. We'll just jump down to the rotations. And rotations are broken into three separate values. A value, or basically a designation for x, a designation for y, and a designation for z. It's really nice. Now orientation is all of them together. So you can control one axis's rotation independently, or you can go in and just kind of deal with all of them together with one keyframe. We'll see how that benefits us later. And then opacity just still has one value because it's not a spatial property. On the composition window, you'll notice that the layer itself now has little color arrows. It has a vertical green arrow for the Y axis. You have a horizontal red arrow for the X, and then we have an arrow pointing right at us. It's kind of hard to tell what it is, but it's the Z. So these are basically handles that you can grab and start to move your layer around in that particular dimension. So I'm not going to do that just yet. I'm going to go back down to the timeline and look at the position attribute, and I'm going to scrub left or right for my X. That looks normal. Scrub left or right for my Y, goes up and down, so that's pretty traditional. We've been doing that. Now for the third one, if I scrub left or right, it's kind of hard to tell, but what it's doing is the one is moving back in space, and I can just keep dragging it. Or if I'm going into the negative values, it's getting closer to me and eventually kind of goes off screen. So you can see how it grows and shrinks with this relative distance to us, and we are a sort of default camera. You can put cameras in your comps, but until you do, there's just a default camera, and I won't even confuse you yet about that, right? So I'm just going to set that value back to 0 for the Z, and let's look at how we can manipulate this in space by using these handles. So I can grab the red handle, and even if I drag up and down, it only lets me go left or right because the x-axis is limited to that kind of a movement. If I grab my Y handle, I can drag this thing up or down on the y-axis, hit undo, and then the blue one allows me to push it back or pull it forward. So that's two different ways of how you can move an element through space, is with your values in the timeline or with the handles on the composition screen. One thing you should notice is that if you were to take that Z arrow and start dragging it, it moves in rather low increments. If you hold down Shift, it'll go really fast moving through space. So sometimes you want to get something really far back. You don't want to just have to keep dragging it and dragging it and dragging it, letting go of the mouse, dragging it, letting go of the mouse, dragging it. That's kind of counterproductive. So they put in a shift sort of speed move, which is really cool. And that also works in the timeline with those values. If you hold down Shift while you drag, it goes in greater increments. And if you hold down Command, it does it in really subtle increments. Now, that's just position, right? So what does scale do? Scale is all locked uniformly. And I can only really scale this thing on the X and the Y. I'm not really sure why they gave us a third value for scale, because like I said, our layers cannot have thickness to them. They are wafer thin. So, this is all you get with scale. Orientation. So the first value is X, second value is Y, the third value is Z. go ahead and play with it if you want to right now. I'm going to skip it because I just want to jump down to each axis individually for the rotation. So X rotation. Look at this. This now has, well, I guess it always has. It has revolutions and then degrees. So I'm just going to take the degree value. I'm going to start to go positive, and you can see that this plane of the one is kind of rotating and pivoting along its x-axis, and then I could even flip it over. But what's interesting is that if you get right to about 90 degrees, you see what I mean about how these layers do not have any depth or thickness to them. There's no volume. They're not even paper thin because paper has volume to it. It's really thin, but so let's check that out. 90 degrees, it just kind of goes away. Something you have to get used to thinking. And then if I go negative, it rotates in the opposite direction. And what you should also take note of is that those arrows rotate with it. So you start to see that Z arrow better instead of it being just kind of a blue blob. You can see that it actually is a volumetric arrow that is anchored to this layer and moves around. So that's the X rotation. The Y is obviously going to do something like this. Okay, so now we're pivoting along the Y-axis, kind of like looking around. Hey, what are you guys doing over there? Be a dork once in a while. Z rotation. Now this takes the place of what we were used to rotation being, which is just rotating around the anchor point. So there is the Z rotation. It's rotating around the Z axis, which is basically a thread, invisible thread going straight through this piece from us into infinity. Once you start getting into combinations of rotation, it gets pretty interesting. Now that I've rotated it, now that I've rotated this this layer, if I start moving position now, I'm not really moving in accordance to what the arrows are indicating if I try to use the coordinates in the timeline. If I move my Z further or closer to me, it still behaves as if I haven't spun this thing around. But if I go grab my Z arrow on the screen, Z now means that it's going in that direction. So it gets a little weird once you start having different rotations or orientation to your layers and you're trying to think logically about how to move in a specific direction. You just kind of got to look at the arrows and say, all right, if those arrows make sense to me, I'm going to use the arrows. But if I just want to ignore them, use the values in the timeline. I'm going to reset all of this. Right-click on those properties, making sure I'm back to where I was. I think that looks good. So number 2 is not enabled in 3D space yet. So I'd have to make sure I click on the 3D property. And I'll do the same for number 3. So let's just look at some very basic spatial movements so we can kind of get an idea of what's going on. Let's take them all, hold down Shift and hit P, and that's going to open up your position. Let's take number 1 and pull it kind of close to the camera. I'll have it go off screen a little bit. Number 2, maybe I'll push it back a little. And then number 3, I'm going to push it back quite a bit. So here is now a relationship of these 3 layers in space with only a Z change to them. And from our perspective, looking through this sort of invisible camera, it looks that it appears that there is some depth change, but it's kind of hard to tell really what's going on. So they offer us different types of viewing angles to see what is going on with our layers and how they are actually positioned in this 3D space. I'm going to look at the composition window, and you'll see that there is the active camera, and so far that's all we've been using. If I click and hold that, I end up having orthographic views. the front, the left, the top, the back, the right, and the bottom, or custom views. So if I go to front, front removes any sense of depth or perspective and just gives me a straightforward shot at what the positions are of my objects or my layers in accordance to, and what it really only helps me get a feel for is X and Y, because no matter how far I move something in Z space, it still gives me just a representation of that layer straight up with no perspective, no depth. It's handy when you're trying to make things sit on a floor or butt up against something either on the edge or vertically. The left or right view, I'll just go to right, ends up showing us nothing. We are now on the side of the stage looking at our actors. I'm going to zoom out. That's not zoom out. There we go. So I zoom out quite a bit. I'll have to reposition my screen here. So I'm on the side of my stage looking at the performers that I have told to go closer to the camera or a little further back or way back. This is, if I click on layer 1, it highlights and says, yep, there's layer 1. If I click on layer 2, there's layer 2, and then way back here is layer 3. What you need to get used to is that this black window doesn't really apply when you're looking at your layers in any of these orthographic views, because it has no relevance. It really only matters when you're looking at it through the active camera. So the right view is good for dealing with space, depth, and vertical orientation. Because obviously if I'm going to be moving these things along the X value, that will be moving it left or right, and from the right angle with no perspective or sense of depth, I won't be able to get any sort of reading. You can also look at things from the top. So here is, boy, number 3, you're way back there, aren't you? You're way back there. Zoom out even more. There we go. So here, now we're up on top of our stage. We're like up in the rafters looking down at our actors on the stage. Layer 1, here. Layer 2, here. Layer 3, back here. The top view is really a great perspective or angle for you to work in order to manage depth along the Z and then lateral movements on the left or right or X-axis. The top view doesn't have any beneficial qualities if you're doing movements in the Y-axis because it's up and down. And here again, we don't have any sense of depth or perspective. You could look at things from the bottom, but generally I just use front, top, and right. Because in between using those different angles, you get a good grasp of all the different axes that are being used in your comp, and helps you really kind of understand the space. Now if we jump to custom view number 1, this is where things get kind of interesting. I'm going to zoom back in. There we go. So custom view number 1 now gives us like a view from kind of up on the balcony on the left side of the stage. So now I'm kind of looking down from the left angle at my layers. And this is really kind of handy. But what becomes even more handy is if we use a tool, which is found up in your toolbar, the unified camera tool will allow you to grab and move this angle around, and you can say, well, that custom view is pretty good, but I need to see a little bit more of it, so I'm gonna move it like this or something. Or it also just gives you kind of a good sense of the space that you've laid out by moving your layers. So we're just kind of moving and orbiting temporarily around so that we can work. This has no impact on what actually is happening in our animation. This is strictly a work tool. It's really awesome. Isn't that awesome? It's cool. So then you can just go back to your active camera, and this is what is going to be made into your movie. This is the view of your movie. From this angle, you can't use that unified camera tool. It just won't work. It only works if you are in one of the custom views. So there's custom view 1, and you can set that up to whatever you want. You can then go to custom view 2, and you can orient that one however you'd like to, and then you can go to custom view 3 and set it up something like this, whatever, so that you can pop back and forth between these different views in addition to your front and your rights and your tops. So it's really kind of a cool way to get a good grasp of the spatial boundaries or lack of boundaries that we have for our project. So if you want to just play around until you watch the next movie, I would just get a grasp on moving some layers around in space, getting a feel for the stage, play with all the different axes, use different tools, meaning try moving these layers with the arrows, and then try moving them with your values in the timeline. Also, one thing I should just quickly show you is that there is a rotation tool, and the rotation tool, if you hover over any of those axes, I'll just, I'll do the 2 instead, it's closer to us. You can rotate along that axis by using the rotate tool on those arrows. Instead of moving them, it will rotate them. So that's pretty cool. Alright, when we watch the next movie, we're going to do some Star Wars business. That should be motivating, right? Fun!